Hey everybody, here with another news update. So we'll do, kind of the same thing like usual. Um, I won't go straight over here just yet. We'll finish off with some of these like collusion, sabotage, espionage kind of things. Okay. Um, all right. First things first. Let's start in Kiev. So really important update came from Minerho yesterday. I can translate this for you guys. So it said massive like destruction and losses of the energy sector from all of 22 to now. It's sort of saying there's over 63,000 energy objects that have been damaged or destroyed. $93 billion worth of damage as of the end of 2024. And we're also seeing 10 gigawatts worth of energy generation that's been destroyed or lost. So some really important statistics there. That's not all, and I just threw them here on the power plant just for the sake of putting it in a convenient location, and because this goes for the whole country, right? It's not specific to this power plant. Okay, so number of attacks since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. There have been 30 massive energy attacks, specifically 13 of which occurred in 2024. 9 of those occurred between 2024, fall of 2024, and winter of 2025. OZP, right? So the fall winter season is that's what that means, OZP. So 13th of December, we saw over 300 different assets being used. That was the largest attack that we saw in the energy sector so far. And then also on the 25th of December, there was the infamous Christmas attack that we ended up seeing as well. So they make a point to note out here, or they make a point to note here that they didn't have to cut off services to people, or well, like they didn't have to implement like other measures, energy restrictions and things like that, while they repaired for like 3 days. Yeah, and okay, so summarizing sort of the events of 2024 and 2025 and where they're at right now. So throughout that time period, 9 different nuclear power generating units were working fully, and between the European Union and Ukraine, 2.1 gigawatts were 2.1 gigawatts of energy were being transferred between the European Union, the AS, and Ukraine. Okay, and over $1.1 billion euros, sorry, have been allocated towards the energy fund for Ukraine. So that'll go towards repairing the energy grid. And as of right now, 60% of the damage incurred throughout these attacks has been repaired or restored. So we've seen some significant progress, right, in terms of dealing with the consequences of those significant attacks. Okay, and this is saying just like a kind of a reminder that the transit of Russian gas is banned still. So they're happy about that, and so are we. Okay, so back to Kyiv. We'll talk about sort of the sabotage thing later. There was an air raid. There's an air raid every night, but as usual, I always do the in memoriam there. So Alexander Moskalenko, a 29-year-old senior soldier from Kyiv, senior sergeant, senior soldat, all right, died on January 30th, 2024, near Chasiv Yar, Donetsk Oblast, from fatal wounds sustained during enemy mortar shelling while on a combat mission. Alexander Moskalenko, along with his schoolmates, participated in the evacuation of civilians in Bucha, Irpin, and Romanovka during the initial stages of the 2022 invasion. In the fall of 2022, Alexander Moskalenko and his unit were deployed to Luhansk Oblast, and in October 2023, Alexander was wounded while defending Chasiv Yar, and he is buried in Kyiv. So, some of Ukraine's best, unfortunately, paying the ultimate price for freedom, but eternal memory to Alexander. Okay. We can see pretty active situation along the Chernihiv, Berdyansk border here. Mostly drone attacks, per usual. We also saw fairly active northern half of Sumy Oblast. And we had some civilians evacuating here. One of the things that I thought was interesting about these civilian evacuations that we were seeing here that I hadn't really seen before was the use of like full-on moving vans. I hadn't seen it in this area. I'd seen people kind of just like getting in armored vehicles and like armored ambulances and getting out of there as quick as possible. So these people were actually able to get some of their like appliances and some of their household items like fully out of their house, which that's pretty good, because we know if this were to ever, not that it will, but if this were to ever fall into occupation, or just any village that falls into occupation, any settlement that falls into occupation, we know of what happens in terms of how Russian soldiers pillage. Okay, drone attacks along the border, pretty quiet there, all things considered, but a lot more active just north of Sumy and just east of Sumy. Specifically, we saw cluster munitions again in Krasnopilia. Again, all of these villages here along the border, Prohody, Turia, Stepok, Prokofka, all the way back to like Samatoyevka and Osayevka are all being hit pretty much every day. So these markers, right, like doesn't account for scale, and it doesn't get every location. But we also saw some pretty significant airstrikes up in Mirapilska Hromada, as well as Unikivska Hromada and Krasnopilska Hromada. More drone attacks in Velika Pisarivska Hromada. But heading into Kharkiv, again, we saw another wave of airstrikes in Zolochivska Hromada in Bohudukivsky Rayon. Taking a look at Kharkiv itself, we saw, again, the drone attacks in Osnovyansky and also in Kievsky district. Obviously, those are the same photo because it was the same post, but don't take these as more illustrative photos. Not all of them are geolocated. Okay, that's not related. And then there were 3 fires. We had an industrial fire, a fire in an industrial building. An 88-year-old woman was injured in another fire, and then we had another fire in Slobitsky as well. So in addition to being sort of like resources being stretched because of the massive drone attacks, we also saw like pretty significant fires throughout Kharkiv that night. We also saw some shelling up here in Slobozhanska, and that injured a 49-year-old woman. We saw civilians leaving Tokarivka Druha. That was after there was a pretty significant airstrike on April 7th, where a man died and 2 women were injured. So most of the civilians, I mean, this is a tiny village. It's a tiny, tiny village. So most of these civilians have left now in Tokarivka Druha, there and there. So that's unfortunate that they've lost their homes, but due to Russian terrorism. Again, drone attacks in Billy Kolodias. We saw that earlier on the 8th, but again on the 9th, we saw another civilian injured there. Moving into this area, we saw civilians evacuating from Kolodiazna near the front line. It's mostly seniors with mobility issues, limited mobility. Those two men were evacuated and brought to Kharkiv and given medical attention as well. We saw a pretty deep strike with MRL on Prosyanka, also in Kupiansk Rayon, which is let's do a little measurement here. Yeah, it's a solid 20 kilometers back from the front line, so it's not that deep for MRL, but okay. Just not typical for what we see here. These villages don't get smacked that much. Okay, lots of evacuations coming out of Kupiansk itself. We saw 14 residents being evacuated from Kupiansk itself and 3 from Kindershivka. Kindershivka is right up here, right? So we have residents evacuating from there. And we also had a man, 57-year-old man, stepped on a AP mine, anti-personnel mine, and sustained eye and hand injuries, unfortunately, as well as artillery shelling that occurred throughout the city as well. Okay. Russians keep pushing from Krylyakivka down towards Bohuslavka, kind of bypassing most of Zaharzova, and they're also kind of pincering Nova Krylyakivka at the same time. So we see some shelling there. All right, beyond that, in Liman, we saw some civilian evacuation operations there. It was an 18-year-old boy in this picture here. He's saying goodbye to his mother and his sister. His mother and his sister didn't want to leave, even though the police in the video try and convince them to leave. There's a lot of people that this is their home and they simply just don't want to go, or they don't feel that the danger level is to such a point where they feel like they have to go. But the 18-year-old son, he went off to go to university, and got off the front line. So they took him to a city to study in an armored ambulance. Okay. What else did we have here? Yes, some good statistics on civilian evacuation operations in Donetsk Oblast. So in 9 settlements of Donetsk Oblast, 254 children remain despite the mandatory evacuation order. Some families with children who were previously evacuated have returned back to those settlements. I've heard some cases of that happening also in Zaporizhia and also in Donetsk, and then those people becoming casualties later on, which is unfortunate, but it does happen because these are active combat zones. So it's if you're under mandatory evacuation, it's probably a good idea to leave, honestly, given Russia's penchant for war crimes. So as of today, about 283,000 residents, including 21,500 children, remain in Ukrainian-controlled territory of Donetsk Oblast. Approximately 29,000 people, including 202 children, live in 17 communities designated as active combat zones. 197 children remain in Limanska Hromada in Donetsk Oblast. 5 children remain in Toretska Hromada. And after their families returned following evacuation. So 5 kids in Toretsk. Can you imagine knowing what Toretsk is like? There's still 5 kids there, as far as we know. 240 children were evacuated from settlements after a mandatory evacuation order during the past week. Okay. So just this week, 240 kids have been evacuated, and we saw in the last update the village just outside of it's just outside of Zhukivka, I believe. Yeah, Kurtivka. Kurtivka here, that village had a lot of its children evacuated after there was a deadly airstrike that wounded a 15-year-old girl and killed a 3-year-old girl and the mother, I believe. And that was maybe 2 weeks ago, or maybe it was only a week ago. I can't remember. But also we saw people leaving from Drobisheve as well. An 88-year-old woman. Her house was destroyed in shelling, so she ended up leaving as well. So we saw many elderly people and some children being evacuated from Limansk, Hromada, Drobisheve, and that area. If we take a look, civilian casualty report for Donetsk Oblast for the 9th into the 10th, they post it on the 10th, so it says 10th on the graphic, but really it's for the 9th. We saw one person was killed in Novoekonomichne, one was killed in Bahatir, one was killed in Konstantinivka, one was killed in Pokrovsk, and 2 people were injured, one in Seversk and one in Liman. So a pretty significant day in terms of civilian casualties for Donetsk Oblast. Pretty deadly day overall. We saw some fires in Kramatorsk. We saw some pretty significant shelling going on in Konstantinivka and Ivanopilia as the Russians continue, as Andrew said, that YOLO out there. The map for the 10th is going to be even crazier in this area. We've added a lot more sourcing for Donetsk Oblast, so the next news update should be many more markers than this one by about like 100, maybe more. So yeah, we saw civilian casualties in Novoekonomichne over here. I can say economy in English, but I can't say it in Ukrainian. Pokrovsk, we saw a civilian casualty there as well. Airstrike in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast on Novopavlivka, in Novopavlivska Hromada. So we don't know if it was in Novopavlivka itself. It could have easily been on like any of these tree lines here that are probably housing or home to trench lines and fortifications potentially. As well as an airstrike on Bahatir, which caused the civilian casualty there. But that's a pretty active combat zone for the last couple of weeks, right? As the Russians push from Andrivka and towards Rozliv and kind of on either side of the river there, pinch Bahatir. Okay. And in Komar, we also saw civilian evacuation operations in Komar after there was an airstrike. So we saw 14 people in the last 2 days have been evacuated from there. A woman and her 9-year-old son. So we still, again, children are being evacuated as quickly as possible from these dangerous frontline towns. Okay, moving into Zaporizhia Oblast, we saw some pretty, like Hulaypala is a pretty significant target all the time. We saw a pretty strong focus on like Mali Sherbaki and Sherbaki, which that's to be expected given the Russian kind of like focus in this area recently and the attack towards Stepova happening towards the west. Again, Kamyanska is being shelled every day as well. And then there were some drone attacks on Malokatarinivka and some shelling on Malokatarinivka a little bit further up the river, which was significant. In Zaporizhia Oblast, some good news in terms of like on the humanitarian front. Over 151.6 million hryvnia were allocated towards like rent, one-time payment for repairs, and roof repairs, roof reconstruction for civilians who've lost their homes or had their homes damaged due to Russian shelling and airstrikes. So that's significant and that's pretty good because we do know like especially like near Arikiv and near Hulaypala, those villages are shelled every single day. Also, we saw some strikes, drone strikes in Nikopol. That's going to be more significant when we talk about the 10th. But again, from like Vyshtarasivka, basically, to Marianska and Hrushivka, you guys can kind of think of that as a probably a no-go zone in terms of like thinking of it as probably human safari-esque, based on the reporting of like Zarina Zabriskie and the reports from the ground. So um, that is that. Let's talk about Kherson. So Kherson, we saw drone attacks in Osokorivka, Novo Alexandrivka, a pretty significant focus on Dudchane. I believe we had a civilian vehicle destroyed there. Yes, yeah. There was a vehicle destroyed in Dudchane. No casualties, though, as far as we know. Um, Beryaslav, obviously a point of focus always from a shelling perspective, or a drone attack perspective. We have geolocated drone attacks there, but there weren't any reported that day. Um, Reported drone attacks in near the concrete plant in Antonivka. Also, a 32-year-old man injured. Um, in Textilna, there was also a drone spotted. Um, One in Dniprovsky district, and then a lot of the time we also see drones near the palace for youth and students here in Dniprovsky district. And you can kind of like think of, like, based on geolocations and based on testimony from documentaries and stuff like that, you can think of basically these streets, Perokropska Street and Universitetska Street. These two kind of like create a corridor that is, as far as I'm concerned, probably pretty hellish. And yeah, we have a car being damaged there, geolocated. So like that evidence backs that up. And then also this like main street right down the middle here, Miro, Vulica. That one gets a lot of drone attacks quite often. So oftentimes I'll throw markers down in there because I know that's happening. We had a lot of fires throughout Kherson that night. In addition to fire on the humanitarian front, there were actually some really interesting developments for internally displaced persons. There's 2 shelters that have been developed by the Kherson administration, and one is sort of formed out of a hotel, and the other is formed out of a school dormitory. And this provides sort of like hotel, small apartment like accommodations for civilians near who have been evacuated from the front, who have lost their homes, or people who are from the other bank. So that gives them shelter, basic food, water, meeting all of those sort of like basic necessities and needs away from the front. And that's not the location. I want to be clear, like the placement of that marker, that's not like a geolocation of where the shelter is, not at all. If I'm not mistaken, actually, this is I think, I'm not positive, but I think this is the correctional facility in Kherson, but I could be wrong. Okay, but it's near the solar farm nonetheless in Pivnichny, for no reason other than I did put it there. Other good news on the humanitarian front: 3 children, 2 boys and a 17-year-old girl, were brought back from Russian occupation. Were saved from Russian occupied territory, and unfortunately, one of the boys, his father, was actually killed by the Russians in an instance of torture, a war crime. So yeah, nothing else. Basic shelling, Bilazerka, Shiroka Balka, and Stanislav. So we saw a man and 2 people. Man killed, 2 people injured. 76-year-old man, his wife, and their son. That's what I thought. And Stanislav, I know We saw 2 reported drone strikes. Okay, and just reported shelling, so nothing special, just a lot. Okay, and then your daily Ochakiv Kutsarub shelling. And now let's talk about our final thing today. Last thing I want to talk about today is 2 things. I want to talk about international aid, and I want to talk about sort of like espionage sabotage, because there were some big developments from the SBU. Oh, wait, nope, I forgot Dnipro. Sorry, I forgot Dnipro, guys. That's what happens when you do the horseshoe. The drone attack, 15 people were injured in the drone attack. Again, I don't have a specific geolocation, but the drone attack at night on Dnipro on the 9th. 15 people, unfortunately, were injured. Okay, international aid, sorry. So we saw in Kharkiv, in southern Kharkiv Oblast, in Barvinkovska Hromada, that there were some construction equipment donated by the German government. So check out maybe German aid to Ukraine, see what he had to say about this in his sheet, maybe, or maybe he put it in a recent article. So check out Gao and maybe see if there's more about that program. And also aid from Japan. Japan gave 2 of their sort of, it's a Komatsu excavator that has a demining attachment on the front of it, which is very useful in these like heavily wooded areas. As you can see, it does destroy the tree lines, but it's a really effective way to demine this territory. And this is the thing, like Balaklia and Izium are some of the worst areas in terms of like the UXO and mining, so unexploded ordnance and leftover mines from when the Russians held this territory in 2022 before the Kharkiv offensive kicked them out. So we do see these are really like super useful and necessary for clearing these like massive tree lines. So that's really good. Japan and Germany doing their part to keep Ukraine going. Okay, so let's talk espionage and some other things. So we saw one of the big pieces of news were 2 foreign nationals. Let's go to Venezia. It's a better illustration, I think, here. Yeah, this one's good. 2 Moldovan foreign nationals, 24, 25 years old, were caught in the act of carrying out sabotage and espionage in Ukraine. And you can see the Moldovan passport here. So that was pretty significant. In addition to that, okay, that's still the same story. Still the same story. We had a lot of espionage. Okay. Okay, that was all there. Okay, Kamyanets-Podilsky in Khmelnytsky Oblast. Let's talk about that. So, a couple, a 24-year-old drug addict and her 57-year-old roommate, aka boyfriend, were arrested, having been implicated in a terrorist plot. They were going to make a explosive, maybe, and maybe plant it, and they got instructions from the FSB, and they were caught by the SBU. Yeah, same thing there. Okay. Cool. So they were caught. Kamyanets-Podilsky, Vinnytsia, Lviv, Zhytomyr. We saw a soldier of the ZSU was actually a double agent. He was working for the GRU at the same time, which is the Russian military intelligence, and he was directing airstrikes against the unit that he was training in Zhytomyr Oblast. So that's pretty significant, and honestly interesting, because we just saw the other night, like right after this, the day after this, there were drone attacks in Zhytomyr. and I believe one person died. So that's interesting to some extent. Um, Zhytomyr doesn't get a lot of action. Well, in Ukraine, they make a joke that Zhytomyr doesn't exist. So um, it's just local humor. Okay, so two 18-year-old, again, the photos, like, they didn't tell me in the SBU or the Kyiv police who was who, but two 18-year-old drug addicts were acting on orders to burn and sabotage objects throughout the railway system in Darnitsky district here. And Darnitsky is sort of like this area here. You kind of take let me get rid of that, kind of take the railway and split it in half, and everything like down here, it's pretty much Darnitsky. So they were disrupting this rail infrastructure. Like, there's really significant railway infrastructure running through this part of Kyiv. So this is going to be a major target of Russian sabotage, and it has been so far. Okay, yeah, I think that's everything, guys. So, oh wait, nope, I forgot one in Kharkiv. We had one in Kharkiv, a 21-year-old Kharkiv resident. He was leaking information on Telegram about defenders and using sort of like geolocation to send targets to people. And okay, yeah, we saw resettlement of IDPs. He was also doing this in Chuhuyev, the same 21-year-old. And yeah, there was a collaborator in Kupiansk that we skipped over. He was working as a specialist in the like state emergency services, so what the Ukrainians call the DSNS, and he was basically aiding them in the creation of their regime over Kupiansk, their occupational regime over Kupiansk. And there was also a woman in Kupiansk district who was from Kyiv Sharivka, and she was also implicated in the administration as well. I think she was essentially working as a secretary of some kind within the administration. Okay. That, I believe, does it. Unless there's any collaboration. No collaborator stories in Kherson. Some in Kherson Oblast. So, 44-year-old woman found guilty of collaboration. Also helping in carrying out faux elections, it would appear. Another woman also implicated in carrying out elections. And again, pseudo-elections. Yeah, so Chaplinska, Hromada, we had three people implicated in carrying out faux elections. And then within Donetsk Oblast, several men were identified as having participated, essentially traitors. They were Ukrainian citizens that then became Russian citizens and joined the Russian army and fought in the units of, as they say, the fake LNR and DNR between 2015 and 2022. And we saw 8 more people join the ranks. So if you take a look at Donetsk and you take a look at Luhansk, you can take a look at their blurred out faces. So nothing too special. That's all I got for you guys today. I know I tried to end it like 3 times already, but I kept finding stuff. So that's it. Stay tuned for another one. Again, if you want to keep up with me, you can follow me on X at Kelly7622, and you can donate to Andrew's Buy Me a Coffee, I think is what he has, if you think that we deserve a tip, and so that we can buy some satellite footage for identifying vehicle losses along the front line. All right. Thank you guys. Have a good one.